In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a matching game where you have these cards that come in pairs with pictures on the other side, and you have to flip them over to try to get all the pairs. So these two are not a pair, so they turn back over. Those two aren't a pair, so they turn over. But there's a pair, so they're going to stay up. And now there's the other pair and the final pair. And now it tells me that I won, and I can click this reset button and start playing again. Let's start with the user interface. We're going to represent our cards using buttons so that they will be clickable. And because we want them to be in that nice table, we're going to need a table layout. So I'll go under Layout and choose Table Arrangement. You can choose to have as many cards as you want to, but I'm going to have 6. And in order to do that, I'll need to add another row. So I'm going to change this to 3 rows. So I have 3 rows and 2 columns. Now let's get those buttons. So I'll go under User Interface, and I'm just going to drag 6 buttons onto the screen. These are ultimately going to hold a picture of the card, and then once you click on it, it will turn into the picture of whatever it is that you have behind that. But for now, I'm just going to leave them like this, and then once we get into the code, I'll actually change it so that they'll show up correctly. Something you will need to do is to get those pictures that you're going to use. I'll include links in the description for the ones I used, but you're welcome to use whatever you want. You will need to make sure you upload it to media. So I've already gotten the background image, which is called Purple Square, but I'll also need to get the images of what's going to be on the opposite side of the buttons. So go ahead and upload those. So I have pictures of rabbits, cats, and dogs that I'll use. Now I'll also need to get a notifier so that we can bring up that pop-up when the user wins the game. And I'll need a clock so I can have that wait time between when they click the card and when we flip them back over if it's not a good match. That's under Sensors and Clock. We'll also need that reset button at the bottom for the user to click once they finish one round. And I'll change the text to say reset. Okay, let's get to the code. Let's start by defining our variables. We're going to want to consider this game in terms of pairs. So at any moment when a user clicks on another card or another button, they're either going to be completing a pair, that is, this is the second card that completes one pair, or they'll be starting a new pair. So if they're starting a new pair, we just have to wait until they choose the second one, versus if they're finishing up a pair, then we need to check to see whether or not that's a match. So I want a variable that will hold whatever was the first thing in that pair so that I can reference it when I need to. So I'm going to define that variable, and I'll call it first flip. And I'm going to start off as -1 so that we'll know that when we see -1, that means we haven't had that first element of our match yet. I'm also going to have a variable for second flip, which is the second member of a pair. So I'm just going to copy and paste this with Control-C and Control-V, or Command-C and Command-V, and I'll change this to second flip. Now I need a variable to hold the number of pairs that have been matched so that I can tell whether the user has won the game. So I'll paste another one of these and call this flipped pairs. And this will start off at 0 because they haven't yet gotten any pairs yet. I'll want a list that will hold all of the cards that have been matched, and this will become important later. I'm going to call it matched, and it will start off empty, so I'll go under lists and choose create empty list. I'll also want an empty list that's going to be able to match up our cards with their corresponding pictures. So I'll just copy and paste this, and I'm going to call it card pick pairs. Okay. Next, I'm going to define our reset function, which will be called both when the screen initializes for the first time and when the user presses that reset button. And that's just going to reset everything that needs to be reset so that the game can be played again. So this is going to be a procedure, which is just a block of code that can be called to run multiple times. So I'm going to go to Procedures and choose this one, which says toProcedureDo, which is how we define a procedure. I will call it reset. And before I forget, I'm just going to go ahead and call it when I need to. So first, when the screen initializes, I'll go to screen 1 and choose when screen1.initialize, and I'm going to call that function. So I'm going to go to Procedures and choose call reset. And this is also going to happen when the reset button is clicked. So for me, that's button 7. This is whatever one is outside of your table arrangement. And we use when button 7.click. Then we also call reset. Okay, so let's actually code this reset function. First of all, let's set the number of flipped pairs to 0 because whatever happened in the previous round, we're now back to 0 pairs being flipped. So I'm just going to mouse over this and get that set global flipped pairs to, and I want to set it to 0. So I'll go to math and choose 0. I also want to reset both our matched list and our card pick pairs list. The matched list because now, again, we don't have any pairs that have yet been matched, and the card pick pairs because we want to randomize which cards get matched to which picture on the other side. So those will again be empty lists, so I'll just mouse over this and choose set, and then we want to make this an empty list. So I want to copy and paste this, and then I'll just copy and paste this whole thing and change this to card pick pairs. Alright, so let's first do that part I was talking about before where we didn't actually put in the pictures inside of Designer, and that's because we can now do that much more easily using code. So I'm going to use a for loop to loop over each button, which will allow us to be able to only have the code to reset at once and not have to copy and paste it for each of our 6 buttons. So to get a loop, I'm going to go under Control, and I'm going to do for each item and list. I'm going to call this card so we know what we're referring to here. And our list will just be a list of our 6 buttons. So I'm going to make a list. And then this should have 6 slots in it. And we just need to get those buttons. So go ahead and go to button 1, scroll down, and choose the button. I'll just copy and paste this for my 6 buttons. And put these in here and change them correctly. Alright, so what are we going to do for each of our buttons? Well, first of all, we want to enable our buttons, and that means to make them clickable, because at some points in the program we'll be disabling some of our buttons so that once a card is flipped over, it can't be flipped again. So to do that, we're going to go down here and we're going to click on any component, which allows us to manipulate any one of the buttons. Click on any button and go to the enabled block and choose set button.enabled. When it says of component, that's asking which button. And that button is just going to be card because card is going to take on each of these buttons separately. So I'll mouse over this and choose get card. We want to set it to true because it is enabled. That's under logic and true. We'll also need to set the widths and the heights. This is because in our designer, currently they might not be very ideally sized so that once we put the pictures on there, they'll just be crazy huge. And it's true that this isn't something we really need to do when we hit the reset button, but because we're also calling this when we initialize the screen, it'll be convenient to just go ahead and do that now as well. So I'm going to go under any component again, go to button, then get the height and width. So set the height, and again this is the card component. I found that 20% worked well, but you might want to play around with this to see what you like. To do the number, go to math, and then get that 0, but change it to 20. And I'm just going to copy and paste this whole thing, but change it to width now. Actually, you'll want to change this one to height percent, not height, because height deals with pixels, and height percent is better because it allows us to be more standardized across multiple devices. Now we'll want to set the text. Again, this is so we don't have to manually get rid of text for button X. So I'm just going to copy and paste this and change it to text. We'll get rid of this, and then go under text and choose the empty quotes. We also need to set those images back to our background. So I will paste another one of these and change this to image. And for this one, you're going to put in the file name under here as a text box. So I'll go to text and choose this, and then put in whatever the file name is of your background image. And you can see that by going to Designer, and then going under Media and seeing what yours was. So mine is called purple_square.png. This would be a good place to stop now and test it out on your phone and see what happens when you launch the app. Are you able to get these pictures? Now we need to match each of these buttons to the actual picture, which we won't show yet, but which will show when the user clicks on the card. So to do that, I'm going to first create a list of all of our buttons, and that's going to be stored in a local variable because we aren't really going to need it many other places. So I'll go to Variables and choose Initialize Local Name, and I'm going to change this to cards. And we're going to want to make a list of all of those cards. We actually just have that up here, so I can copy and paste this. Now what we're going to do is we're going to loop over each of our images. So I'm going to go get a for loop, and then again we're going to want for each item in list, but I'm going to call this for each pick in list, and then this will be a list of each of our file names of our images to go on the other side. So I'll make a list, and I have 3 images, so I'll want to add one more. And then again, just like we did up here, this is going to be using text boxes with your image names. So these should be whatever you called your images. Now for each of these images, we want to assign it to 2 different cards. So we're going to want to pick 2 cards randomly from this list and give them one of these images. So because we're going to be doing that twice, I'll get another for loop that will run 2 times. So I'll just choose this, and I'm going to choose as my upper ground 2. So this will go from 1 to 2 by 1, which means it will go 2 times. I'm going to want a variable that will hold a card that we pick randomly from this list. So I'm going to get another local variable and choose this to card. And this is going to be an item that we select randomly from our cards list. So I'll go to lists and choose pick a random item, and the list is cards. So I'll mouse over this and choose get cards. Now we'll want to do 2 things. First of all, if you remember, we had this list up here called card pick pairs. This is going to come in handy now. It's actually going to be a list of lists. So its elements are each a list with 2 things inside of it. The first thing is going to be the actual card or button, and the second one is going to be the corresponding picture, so that we'll be able to match them up easily. So let's first add those 2 as a pair to our card pick pairs list. So I'm going to go to list and choose add items to list. The list that we're adding to is the card pick pairs, so I'll go to variables and choose get and make this card pick pairs. The item is actually itself going to be a list because it's a list of lists. So I'll go to lists and choose make a list, and it's going to have 2 items. First of all is the card, and that's what we made right here, so I'm going to get that. And the other thing is the picture, so I'll mouse over pick and choose get pick. Now, the next thing we need to do, which is really important, is to make sure we delete this card from our local cards list. And that's important because if we don't delete it, then it's possible that the next time we go through this loop, we'll choose the same card, so that we'll be overriding it and setting it to a new image, which means that some of our other buttons aren't going to get images and it's not going to work out right. So I need to make sure I'm removing it from that list. I'll go to lists and choose remove item. First, it again asks for which list are we removing from, and that is from our cards list, so I'll get that list. You'll notice that it actually asks for the index, not the item. So we can't just tell it that we want to remove this card, we have to figure out where card is in this cards list. And there's actually just a function that can do that. If we go over here, there's one called index in list. So we can just use that, and when it says thing, that's going to be our card, and the list is cards. Alright, so we're all done here. Now we're going to define another procedure that will be called flip, and this is what we're going to do whenever anyone clicks on a button, and it's going to cover all the cases that might happen. So to define another procedure, I'm going to just scroll up here to get some more room, go to procedures, and again choose to procedure do. Now this time I'm going to want to make sure my procedure has an input, which is something that we tell the procedure that will affect how it runs. In this case, I want to make sure that when I call it, we know which button has been pressed, because that's going to be important in determining our next step. To add an input, you just click on this one and drag this over. And I'm going to change it from X to card. I'll also change this name to flip. Let's go ahead and figure out when we're going to call this, and that's just going to be when any one of our buttons is pressed. We're actually going to need to do those individually, so just go ahead and pick on your button 1 and choose when button 1.click, and then we're going to want to call this procedure. So I'll go to procedures and choose the call flip one, and then when it asks for card, we're going to pass in button 1 because button 1 was clicked. So I'll go to button 1, scroll to the bottom, and get that button 1. We're going to want to do this for all 6 buttons, so just copy and paste this 5 more times. And then make sure you change both this button 1 and the button 1 that's in this call statement to the next button. So I'll change these to button 2, and then this one will be to button 3, etc. Alright, so now when any of these buttons are clicked, we're going to go to this flip function. So what's it going to do? First of all, no matter what happens, we definitely want to show what's on the other side of that card. So we're going to want to change the image on that button. That's going to be another any component thing because we don't really know which button it's going to be yet, so we can't just choose one of these buttons components. So let's go to any component and click on button and choose the image one, which is right here. The component is just card because that's which button was pressed. Now to figure out which picture we're going to set, this is when that list card pick pairs is going to come in handy. Go under lists and scroll to the bottom. There's something called look up in pairs of key and pairs. This allows us to go to a list that had stored the keys and the values, which in this case our keys were our buttons and our values were our pictures, so that we can match this up as pairs. So let's drag that down. When it says key, that means what are we searching for in our list. You can kind of think of this as equivalent to a dictionary. When you're looking up in a dictionary, you have a word in mind and you want to find its matching definition. So here, our word is our button and its definition is a picture, and we want to match those up together. So for key, that's going to be card. And pairs is kind of like our dictionary. It's our thing that we're looking in. So for pairs, that's going to be our card pick pairs list. We also want to disable this button because we don't want to be able to click it now that it's already been flipped. Again, our component is card, and this is going to be false because it is not enabled. Now we're going to need to cover the different cases that we have. First, let's look at the case that this is the first one of this pair. So maybe the last time they clicked a button, they completed a pair, and now we're starting a new one. So we don't really need to do much in this case because we don't need to check to see if it's a match because we haven't gotten the other element of that pair yet. So to check if that's the case, this is when that variable called first flip comes in handy. You'll remember that we decided that it would be -1 whenever we haven't gotten the first member of that pair yet. So if first flip is -1, we know that we're starting a new pair. So I'm going to get an if statement to deal with, check to see if first flip is -1. If it's -1, all we need to do is now set first flip to be this card, because now this is the first thing in that pair. So I'm going to get set and set first flip to the card. Alright, so now let's get to our second case. Our second case is if this is finishing a pair and we correctly match it. To allow for that, I'm going to click on this and drag down an else if. An else if is a way of considering another condition if the first one isn't true. So to check to see if it's a match, we need to see are their images the same. So again, we're going to use the same technique where we look them up in pairs. We'll need an equal sign to check for equality between the two images. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this one. So the first thing that we're comparing is the picture for this button. And then what we want to compare to that is the picture for the first member of that pair. So whatever was the previous card that they checked. So I'll bring another of these down, but instead of card, we'll be looking at first flip. Now, in that case, we have a match, so first let's increase flipped pairs. Flipped pairs was that variable that kept track of how many matches we've had, and because we have a new match, we want to add one to that. So I'm going to choose set for flipped pairs, and because we're increasing it by 1, we're going to set it equal to itself plus 1. So I'll go under math and choose plus, and then do get, and this will be flipped pairs, oops, and plus 1. I'll also want to set first flip to -1 because this means that we're finishing off a pair, so that first member of the pair no longer applies. Now we also had that list called match that kept track of which cards had been matched. And these two new cards that comprise this match, we're going to want to add those to our matched list. So let's go to add items to list, and our list is matched. And the first item is card. I'm just going to copy and paste this one. And then I'll just copy and paste this block, just changing the second one from card to first flip. Okay, so now we're done covering this case. The last case we need to check is to see if we're completing a pair but incorrectly, so it isn't actually a match. That's the only other option besides these two, so we can use an else clause for that, which covers all the cases that haven't yet been considered. I'll click on this and drag down an else. So this is going to be a little trickier because we're now going to involve the clock. Because once they've clicked on that second card, we want to give them a second to allow them to see that it's a mismatch before we turn the cards back over. So first of all, I'm going to set this second flipped variable, which is like first flip, but it's for the second member of the pair. So let's go to variables and choose set, and I will make this second flip. And I'll set this to card. Now you might be wondering why we can't just use card, why we need this second variable. That will become clear in a moment. Now we're going to want to disable all of the cards, and that's because in this 1 second where they're allowed to see that it's a mismatch, we don't want the player to go clicking on some of the other cards. We want the whole thing to be frozen so they can't click on any more. So we'll need to loop through each of our buttons and disable each of them. So I'm going to get a for loop, and this will go for each card in our list of cards. I think we might have used that earlier, so I'll see if I can copy it from somewhere. Yeah, right here. Alright, and then for each of those, we're going to disable the buttons. So this will be another any component thing. And this will be enabled of component card, and it will be false. Now what we're going to want to do is to start that timer going. So at this point, we'll start a timer, and then once it's reached 1 second, we'll flip the cards back over. The way we do that here is we click on clock 1, and scroll down to set clock 1.timer enabled. So with this, we'll be able to enable or start the timer. So we want to make that true. We have a logic thing right here, so I can just change this to true. Alright, so now we're going to start this timer, and what will happen is we now need another block. So if you scroll here when it says when clock 1.timer, this means when the timer is up or when the timer has gone off. The automatic value for this is 1 second, and that works well for this game, so I don't need to change anything. I'm just going to pull this down. So when our timer goes off, that means we finished giving the user a chance to see what happened. So now we're going to need to change the images on both of those two cards that are up back to the background image. So I'm going to set the image by going to any button and choosing set button1.image. And then the component for the first one is going to be second flip. Now this is why we need to create second flip. Card is only defined within this procedure because it was an input. We can't use that anywhere else, so we have to use this global variable instead. So to get that, I'll go to variables and choose get. And this is second flip. And this is going to be back to our background image. So mine was purple square. You also want to do that for first flip. So I'll do this again and change this to first flip. Now you'll remember that we disabled each one of our buttons so that the user couldn't click on them during this waiting period. But now that the waiting period is over, we want to make sure that they'll be able to click on those buttons again. The thing is, we can't just re-enable all of them because it's possible that some of them have been disabled because they're already part of a match, and we want to make sure that they're not allowed to click on those again. This is why we made the matched list of cards that have been matched, so that we don't enable the ones that are in that list. So let's first loop over each of the buttons. I'm going to grab another for loop. Actually, I can just grab this one because it's going to be pretty similar. And so this is our list of all of our buttons. And now we're going to be using this one just by changing this to true because we're now enabling them, not disabling them. But we only want to do this if the button has not been matched or if it's not in our matched list. So to do that, I'll get an if statement under control and choose this one and move this one underneath. And we want to see if it's in the list. So we can go to lists and choose is in list. The thing is the card, so I'll get that. Then list is matched. So I will go to variables and choose get matched. Now we actually want it to be if not is in list because that means it hasn't been matched yet. So I'll go to logic and choose not. Now we can put these together. Next, we need to disable our clock here, and that means we're going to stop the timer. So I will go back to our clock, scroll down here, and do set clock.enabled and make that false. I'll just copy and paste this and change it to false. So this is going to make sure we stop the timer. And there's actually one other thing we're going to need to do under designer here because the clock automatically starts off as enabled, but we don't want it to be enabled until we have this unmatched pair. Otherwise, we'll keep calling this block every second. So let's go back to designer and then click on clock 1 and turn off timer enabled so that it will start off disabled. At this point, you can also change the timer interval here to be whatever you would prefer it to be. But this is measured in milliseconds, and I think 1 second is a good time length. Now we also need to set first flip to -1. Because since this match didn't work out, we're going to be open to starting a new match, and we don't want to remember what our first flip was before. So I will go to set and change this to first flip and make it -1. Okay, the last thing is, so back in our flip procedure, we need to check to see if the user has won the game. And if they have, we want to give them that notifier letting them know. To check to see if they won the game, we just need to look at our flipped pairs variable, because once that's reached 3 or however many pairs you chose to have, then we know that they're done with the game. So let's get an if statement. And we'll need an equals, comparing flipped pairs to 3, or however many you had. Then we're going to call the notifier. So I'll go to notifier 1, and I'll choose this one that says show message dialog. We need to tell it the message, which will just be telling them that they won the game. So I'll go to text and choose this one. And I'll make the message, you won the game. Then we need a title, which I'll just make a smiley face. And then the button, which I'll just make OK, or you can make it cancel or something along those lines. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe.